The mule was gone on a Tuesday. Joe knew it before she opened her eyes that morning, the same way she sometimes knew weather before the sky had made up its mind. Something in the quality of the silence, the absence of the animal's particular restlessness against the fence post. She lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn, her hand flat on the empty side of the mattress, and understood that the silence extended further than the fence post, further than the barn, further, probably, than the county line. She got up. She checked. She was right on all counts. Thomas had taken the mule, the tin box from beneath the floorboard, and the better of the two bridles. He had left the broken harness, the deed to land that the bank would reclaim before autumn, a daughter asleep in the back room with her mouth open and her hair spread across the pillow like something poured, and a wife who stood in the doorway of an empty barn while the morning came up pink and indifferent over the Kansas plain. Joe stood there a long time. Then she went inside and made breakfast. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now she stood in the hiring office of the Driscoll Cattle Company in Caldwell, Kansas, with her hair pinned back and her good dress on, the blue one, which was not very good but was the best she had, and a letter of reference from Mrs. Clara Holt, who ran the church supper every third Sunday and had eaten Joe's cooking for 11 years and was willing to say so in writing. The man behind the desk was named Aldous Greer. He was the trail boss, though he didn't look like what Joe had imagined a trail boss would look like. He was not large or weathered or dramatic. He was perhaps 45, compact and unremarkable, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had settled into a permanent expression of careful assessment. He read Mrs. Holt's letter without any change in that expression. "You cooked for how many at once?" he said. "Church suppers run 60, sometimes 70. "This is 22 men, every day, on the trail." "I can count, Mr. Greer." He looked up at her then. It was a measuring look, the kind she had received many times in her life from many different men, and she had learned to stand inside it without flinching, without softening, without doing any of the things that might make it easier for them. She stood inside it now and looked back at him with her face giving nothing away. "The last cook we had quit in Wichita," Greer said. "The one before that broke his leg at the Red River crossing. I've done 2 drives without a cook, and I don't intend to do a third. The men eat bad, they work bad. It's arithmetic." He set down the letter. "Pay is $40 for the full drive, Caldwell to Abilene. That's roughly 2 months, depending on weather and water. You'd have a wagon, a team, full authority over provisions. The men eat what you cook. You don't answer to anyone but me." $40. Joe did the arithmetic of her own, the kind she had been doing since Tuesday 6 weeks ago. $40 was 4 months of rent on a decent room in Caldwell. It was school clothes for Wren and shoes that fit and a winter's worth of coal and something left over. Something small but real, the beginning of a thing that was not borrowed or begged or owed. $40 was the difference between one kind of life and another. "The boarding house on Maple Street offered me 12, she said, "for the season." Greer's expression didn't change. "I'm not the boarding house." "No," Joe said, "you're not." She thought about Mr. Cutter, who owned the boarding house on Maple Street, with his soft hands and his way of standing too close, and his smile that meant something other than what smiles were supposed to mean. She thought about Wren at Mrs. Dunmore's house, sleeping in the narrow bed in the sewing room, being very good and very quiet, the way she had learned to be when things were uncertain. She thought about the look on her daughter's face the morning after Thomas left. Not grief exactly, more like a careful rearranging of expectations, a 7-year-old's terrible pragmatism. And something in Joe's chest tightened and then went hard. "I'll need an advance," she said. $5 against my pay, for my daughter's board while I'm gone. Greer studied her. "You have a daughter?" "I do." "Where's her father?" Joe held his gaze. "Gone." A pause. Something moved briefly across Greer's face and was gone before she could name it. He opened the desk drawer and counted out $5 in coin and set it on the desk between them. "Drive leaves Friday morning," he said. "Dawn. You'll want to be at the wagon by 4 to get the fire going. The men eat before first light." Joe picked up the coins. They were cold and solid and real in her palm. "I'll be there at 3:30, she said. She spent Thursday with Wren. They walked along the creek south of town, where the cottonwoods were coming into their summer fullness, trailing long, pale fingers in the slow water. Wren was a serious child, small for her age, with Joe's dark eyes and Thomas's unfortunate habit of asking questions that had no comfortable answers. "How long?" Wren asked. She was waiting, her shoes in her hand, watching her own feet in the shallow water. 2 months, maybe a little more." "That's the whole summer." "Yes." Wren considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. A dragonfly landed on a nearby reed, and she watched it without reaching for it, which was a kind of maturity that sometimes broke Joe's heart. "Mrs. Dunmore smells like camphor," Wren said. "I know." "She's very kind." "She is," Wren agreed, in a tone that acknowledged both the kindness and the camphor without resolving the tension between them. Then, "Are there bad men on the cattle drive?" Joe was quiet for a moment. The water moved around her daughter's ankles, brown and warm and unhurried. "There are men," Joe said carefully. "Some of them will be difficult. Most of them will come around." "Come around to what?" "To minding their own business." Wren looked up at her then, and Joe saw in her daughter's face the question she wasn't asking, the one that lived beneath all the other questions. "Are you going to be all right?" It was the wrong question for a child to carry. Joe knew that. She also knew that Wren had been carrying it for a long time, probably longer than Tuesday 6 weeks ago, probably since long before that. And there was nothing to do about it now except answer honestly. "I'm going to be all right," Joe said. "I'm better at this than most people think." Wren nodded slowly, as if filing this information somewhere useful. Then she reached down and picked up a flat stone and skipped it with a flick of her small wrist. 1, 2, 3, 4 skips, and watched it sink. "Bring me something back," she said. "What do you want?" Wren thought about it seriously. "A feather," she said, "from somewhere I've never been." Friday came up cold for June, a thin wind cutting down from the northwest that smelled like rain still a day or two away. Joe was at the wagon at 3:25 as promised. The camp was outside town, on the flat ground beyond the stockyards, and the cattle were already restless in the pre-dawn dark. She could hear them, that low collective sound, not quite moaning, not quite breathing. The sound of several hundred animals that did not want to be where they were. She had made this walk before, in her mind, many times over the past 2 days. She had decided what her face would do, and what her hands would do, and how she would move through the space of the camp kitchen, which was the wagon's tailgate and the ground around it, as if she had been doing it for years and found it unremarkable. The fire she built was good. She knew fire. She had a Dutch oven going and coffee on before the first man appeared out of the dark, and she did not look up when he stopped short at the sight of her. "What in the—" he said.
"Coffee's ready,"
Joe said.
"Tin cups are in the crate on the left side of the wagon. Breakfast in 20 minutes.
A silence. Then the sound of him finding the crate. They came in ones and twos after that, drawn by the fire and the coffee smell. And each one stopped, and each one she met with the same information delivered in the same tone. Coffee ready, cups in the crate, breakfast in 20 minutes. By the 5th man, the stopping had shortened. By the 8th, it was barely a pause. Men were practical about coffee in the early morning. It was one of the things she had counted on. She was cracking eggs into the second pan, 32 eggs, a calculation she had made and confirmed and made again, when she heard a different kind of quiet behind her. Not the quiet of surprise, the quiet of something being decided. She turned around. There were 3 of them, standing just outside the fire's light, and the one in the center was perhaps 25, lean and loose-limbed, with a handsome, careless face that had not yet learned to be ashamed of itself. He was holding his coffee cup and looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately, and had been preparing for since Friday was still Thursday. "Boys were saying Greer hired a woman," he said. "Boys were right," Joe said, and turned back to the eggs. "I'm saying I don't see how that works." Joe moved the pan. The eggs needed moving. "It works the same way everything else works," she said, "with effort and without complaint." One of the other 2 laughed, a short, surprised sound, quickly swallowed. The handsome one was quiet for a moment. "I'm Denny Falk," he said, and there was something in his voice that was still deciding whether to be hostile or charming, had not quite committed either way. "I know who you are," Joe said, though she didn't. "Breakfast in 12 minutes. She heard him consider her back for another moment, then move away. She let out a breath slowly through her nose, keeping her shoulders still, keeping her hands steady on the pan. The sky was beginning to pale in the east when Aldous Greer appeared at the edge of the firelight, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stood for a moment watching her work. She was aware of him the way she was aware of most things, peripherally, precisely, without making it obvious. "Any trouble?" he said quietly. "Not yet," Joe said. Greer drank his coffee. "Falk's going to be a problem." "Most things worth doing have a problem in them somewhere." Another pause. She could feel him looking at her with that careful, assessing look, the same one from the office, and she kept her attention on the food because the food was what mattered, and because she had learned that attention was a kind of power, and she was not willing to give any of it away this morning. "All right," Greer said, as if she had said something that settled something. He set down his cup and walked away into the gray dawn. At 4:50, with the sky gone from black to the color of old pewter, Joe rang the triangle and called out in a voice that carried across the whole camp, clear and without apology, "Come and get it!" 22 men came. She fed them all. And when the herd began to move north, with the sun still barely a promise on the horizon, Joe climbed up onto the wagon seat, took the reins in her sun-darkened hands, and followed. Thinking of Wren, thinking of $40, thinking of the feather she had promised from somewhere her daughter had never been. She did not think about what was behind her. There was no point in that. What she didn't know yet, couldn't know in the way that beginnings conceal what they are beginning, was that $40 and a feather were not the only things this trail would ask her to carry before it was done. The first thing you learned on a cattle drive was that the herd set the clock. Not the sun, though the sun mattered. Not the trail boss, though he mattered more. The herd, 2,000 head of Texas Longhorn, slow and contrary and possessed of a collective stubbornness that no individual animal could have managed alone. The herd decided when the day began and when it ended, and what the quality of the hours between would be. If they moved well, the day had a kind of brutal grace to it. If they didn't, the day was simply brutal. Joe had known this in the abstract from listening to men talk in the Driscoll yard. She knew it differently by the end of the first week. She was up 2 hours before the hands, working in the dark by lantern light, because the hands needed coffee and biscuits before first light, and the fire needed time, and the fire needed wood she had to source the night before, and the sourdough starter she kept in a crock, wedged between flour sacks, needed tending like something alive, which it was. She drove the chuck wagon ahead to the next camp position each afternoon while the herd was still moving, which meant she was driving alone across country she hadn't seen yet, reading the land for water and level ground and shelter from wind, making decisions that would determine whether 14 men slept adequately or miserably. She cooked 2 meals a day and kept a third ready for the night riders who came in at intervals, smelling of cattle and exhaustion. She maintained the wagon's inventory, tracked what was used, rationed what was scarce, and kept a running account in a small ledger that Aldous Greer had left in the wagon's front box, along with a note that said only, "Keep the numbers honest." She kept the numbers honest. What she had not anticipated, though perhaps she should have, was the men. Not all of them. It would be unfair to say all of them. There was Emmett Flood, who was 17 and homesick and ate everything she put in front of him with a gratitude so naked it was almost painful to witness. There was a Mexican hand called Segundo, who spoke little English and communicated primarily through a system of nods that Joe had, by the end of the first week, learned to parse with reasonable accuracy. There was an older man named Tully, who had been on more drives than he could accurately count, and who treated Joe with the same businesslike indifference he extended to every other element of the trail, as a condition to be managed, neither good nor bad, simply present. And then there was Haskell. Pete Haskell was 31 years old, broad through the chest, and had been on 3 previous Driscoll drives. during which, she gathered, he had occupied a position of informal authority among the hands. Not trail boss, not foreman, but the kind of man who sets the temperature of a group by virtue of being loud and confident and largely unchallenged. He had a way of standing at the fire that suggested he had built it himself. He had a way of accepting a plate that suggested he was doing the cook a favor by eating. The first evening, he had looked at the biscuits and said, loud enough for the circle to hear, "Driscoll's gone soft, hiring a woman for this." Joe had said nothing. She had served the next man down the line. The second evening, he had said, "My aunt makes better coffee and she's been dead 6 years." Joe had said nothing. She had refilled Emmett's cup. The third evening, he had reached past her to take a second portion of salt pork before she had finished serving the first round, and his arm had brushed her shoulder in a way that was not accidental, and he had looked at her while he did it, with an expression she recognized, not desire exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that was mostly about demonstrating that he could. She had looked back at him. She had said very quietly, so that only he could hear, "Do that again, and I'll put something in your food that'll have you off your horse for 3 days. And before you decide whether I'm joking, ask yourself how well you know what's in that pot." Haskell had stared at her. He was not a stupid man, which was, in a way, the useful thing about him. A stupid man would have escalated. Haskell had read her face, made a calculation, and stepped back. He hadn't stopped watching her, but he had stopped reaching. By the third week, something had shifted. She couldn't have said exactly when. These things don't announce themselves. They accumulate, the way a river cuts a channel not in a moment, but over years of patient insistence. She had simply kept doing her work, kept doing it well, kept doing it without apology or excessive performance, and somewhere in that accumulation, the men had recalibrated. Haskell still didn't like her, but he ate everything she cooked, which she understood to be, in its way, a form of surrender. Emmett had started saving her the good pieces of firewood without being asked. Segundo had, one evening, wordlessly repaired a wheel spoke on the chuck wagon that she had been managing around for 4 days. Tully, who spoke to no one more than strictly necessary, had once paused beside her fire and said, "Beans are good," and moved on, and she had understood this to be the highest praise he was capable of offering. The work itself had a rhythm now. Her body had adjusted to the hours. The brutal early rising had stopped feeling like violence and started feeling simply like mourning. Her hands had hardened. She could judge the heat of a Dutch oven by holding her palm 6 inches above the lid, and she could time biscuits by the smell alone, and she had learned which hands took their coffee black, and which wanted it sweetened, and which wanted it so strong it was nearly a solid. And she provided accordingly without being asked, because that was the job, and she had decided at some point in the first week that if she was going to do the job, she was going to do it completely. It was in this third week that she began to notice the trail boss. Callum Brodie had spoken to her 4 times in 3 weeks, once on the first morning to tell her the drive was moving out, once on the 5th day to ask if the provisions were holding, once on the 9th day to inform her that they would be crossing Bluff Creek the following morning, and the water would be fast, and she should know that. And once, this one she turned over in her mind more than she meant to, On the 14th evening, when he had come to the fire late after the other men had gone to their bedrolls, and stood at the edge of the firelight and said, without preamble, "You're running a good camp." Then he had taken his coffee and walked back into the dark. She had stood there for a moment with the ladle in her hand, watching the place where he had been. "You're running a good camp." 4 words. She had the sense, from what the hands said and mostly didn't say about him, that 4 words from Callum Brodie represented a significant expenditure. She had thought about it more than was sensible. She noticed things about him the way she noticed things about the country, not with any particular intention, but because she was observant by nature, and the trail offered limited variety, and the mind will find its points of interest where it can. He was methodical in a way that was almost aesthetic. She watched him manage the herd decisions with a kind of quiet authority that had nothing theatrical in it. He didn't raise his voice, didn't perform certainty, simply moved through the days making the necessary calls with a consistency that the cattle and the men both seemed to find reliable. He was hard on no one without cause. When Emmett had made a bad mistake on the 12th day, a moment of inattention that had cost them 2 hours of work and very nearly a broken leg for one of the swing riders, Brodie had corrected him in a voice so level it was almost kind, and then had not mentioned it again. He ate alone, or nearly. He took his meals at the fire with the men, but sat slightly apart, not unfriendly, simply contained in a way that discouraged casual conversation without actively refusing it. He had a horse, a gray roan he called nothing she had ever heard him say aloud, that he tended with a consistency that bordered on ceremony. He was, she thought, a man who had organized his life around not needing things. She recognized this. She had been trying to do the same thing for 6 weeks. It was Tully who mentioned it without meaning to. They were at the fire on the evening of the 20th day, the sky going the particular deep blue that preceded full dark out on the open country. And Tully was doing the thing he occasionally did, where he talked at the fire rather than at anyone in particular, as if the flames were an adequate audience. "Brodie's riding drag," he said. Joe looked up from the pot she was tending. "He usually rides point." "Usually." Tully was quiet for a moment. "Riding drag puts him at the back of the line. Back of the line puts him behind the chuck wagon." Another pause. "Man's been back there 3 days now." Joe did not say anything. "Funny place for a trail, boss," Tully said, and poked the fire, and said nothing else. She went back to the pot. She kept her face neutral, which was something she had become good at. She thought about the gray roan she had been seeing at the edge of her peripheral vision on the afternoon drives, maintaining a distance that was too consistent to be accidental. She thought about the way Brodie had positioned himself at the fire on the last several evenings, still slightly apart from the men, but with the orientation of his body subtly, barely perceptibly changed. She thought about a man who had organized his life around not needing things, and what it meant when such a man began, slowly and without any apparent intention, to arrange himself in the direction of something. She did not let herself think about it directly. It was too early for that, and she had too much else to carry, and she was practical above all things. But that night, banking the fire for the last time, she looked out toward the dark where the herd was settling and the night riders were beginning their slow circuits. And somewhere out in that dark was a man on a gray roan who had spent 3 days finding reasons to be where she was. And she felt something move in her chest,
that she hadn't felt in long enough that she almost didn't recognize it. Almost. She was still standing there when she heard it, a sound from the far edge of camp, low and urgent, one of the hands calling out in a tone that was not quite alarm, but was headed there. Then Haskell's voice, sharp, "Brody!" And then, a moment later, Brody's voice, the one she had heard only 4 times in 3 weeks, level and certain. "Get her!" The her being, she understood with a sudden cold clarity, herself. She was already moving. She moved without a lantern because there was no time to light one. The dark beyond the fire's reach was the particular dark of open Kansas grassland. Not absolute, not kind, but honest in the way that darkness with stars overhead can be honest, showing you shapes without edges, distances without certainty. Joe had been navigating it for 3 weeks, and she had learned to trust her feet more than her eyes, to let the ground tell her what her vision couldn't. She followed Haskell's voice. He was standing at the northeast edge of camp where the remuda was picketed, and there were 3 other hands with him. Dix, and a man called Sutter, and young Emmett, who was holding a torch that threw more shadow than light. They were standing in a loose half-circle facing outward, toward the dark, and none of them looked at her when she arrived. "What is it?" she said. Not a question. The tone she had learned to use in 3 weeks. Flat, functional, expecting an answer. "Brody said to get you," Haskell said. He still wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ground near the picket line. "I see that. What is it?" Emmett shifted the torch and she saw. One of the horses, a sorrel she had noticed before because it stood quieter than the others, because it had a way of watching the camp with what seemed like mild philosophical interest, was down on its side. Not sleeping. The angle was wrong for sleeping. Its legs were extended and rigid, and its neck was stretched out flat against the ground, and even from 6 feet away she could hear the breathing, which was labored and wet and had a quality that made the back of her teeth ache. "How long?" she said. "Dix found her maybe 20 minutes ago," Emmett said. "She was standing then, but she went down fast." Joe crouched without being asked and moved closer. The horse's eye was visible in the torchlight, wide and dark and showing white at the rim. She had grown up with horses. She had helped her father with 3 difficult foalings and 1 bad colic, and she knew what she was looking at now was not colic. The rigidity was wrong for colic. The breathing was wrong. She put her hand on the horse's neck. The muscle beneath was twitching in small, rapid pulses. "What did she get into?" Joe said. Silence behind her. She turned and looked at the men and saw it on their faces. Not guilt exactly, but the particular arrangement of a face that is deciding how much to say. "What," she said, "did she get into?" Emmett looked at Haskell. Haskell looked at the ground. "There was a bucket," Dix said finally. He was a quiet man from somewhere in the Missouri breaks, weathered and careful with words. "With some mash in it. Somebody left it near the line." "Somebody," Joe said. "We don't know whose it was." Joe stood up. She looked at the horse. She looked at the bucket that she could now see lying on its side several feet away, and even from here, even over the smell of the grass and the night and the torch smoke, she caught it. The sour, sweet smell that she associated with bad grain, with grain that had sat too long in heat or wet, that had gone over into something the body could not process correctly. "Has she passed anything?" she said. "Not that we saw." She thought.
She thought about what she had in the chuck wagon, not because she was a veterinarian, not because she had any formal knowledge of this, but because she had a practical and organized mind, and she had spent 3 weeks cataloging every item in her inventory, and she knew what she had and what it could do. "I have mustard powder," she said. "I have linseed oil. I have warm water, which I can have in 10 minutes if someone builds the fire up. I cannot promise anything, but if you want to try, we try now."
"She's a good horse," Emmett said, and there was something in his voice that was young and earnest and not at all embarrassed about being either.
"Then let's not waste time talking about it," Joe said. She worked for the better part of 2 hours. She was not certain it was the right treatment. She was not certain of anything except the process, which was the same thing she applied to every problem she encountered. Identify what you have, determine what is possible, do the most possible thing with the most efficiency you can manage, and do not stop until the situation changes. The fire was built up. Water was heated. She mixed what she mixed and administered it with a patience that required 4 men to hold the horse still. And she talked to the animal the entire time in the same low, uninflected voice she used when she was working alone. Not because she believed the horse understood her, but because silence made everyone more anxious, and anxiety made everything harder. Haskell held the horse's head. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. Around midnight, the horse's breathing changed. Not dramatically. There was no sudden crisis, no resolution you could point to. But the wet, labored quality began to ease, and the leg rigidity softened, and the animal's eye, which had been fixed and showing too much white, shifted and blinked. "There," Joe said quietly. Nobody cheered. These were working men, and they understood that there was not finished, that the horse would need watching until morning, and possibly longer, and that you did not celebrate until the sun came up and the animal was standing. But the quality of the silence changed. Something that had been held loosened slightly. Dick said, "You knew what to do." "I knew what to try," Joe said. "There's a difference." She sat back on her heels and looked at her hands, which were dirty and smelled of linseed oil. "Someone needs to stay with her tonight. Wake me if she goes down again." "I'll stay," Emmett said. Joe stood up. Her back ached from crouching, and her knees were stiff with cold, and she had been awake since before 3 in the morning, which meant she had been awake for close to 22 hours, and she would need to be up again in approximately 4 hours to start breakfast. She picked up her things and turned to go. "Aldridge?" It was Haskell. She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She had learned that too, the pause, the deliberate moment before turning, which established that you were not startled, and you were not eager, and you were not afraid. She turned. Haskell was still crouching by the horse's head. In the torchlight, his face was difficult to read. It was always difficult to read. It was a face that had spent years not showing things. But there was something in the set of his jaw that was different from his usual register of skepticism or contempt. "That was good work," he said. The words came out the way a man might move a heavy piece of furniture, carefully, without wanting to, but with the acknowledgement that the furniture needed to be moved. Joe looked at him for a moment.
"The horse did most of it," she said, and she walked back to camp.
She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. She had not slept well in 3 weeks, had not slept well since the Tuesday morning she had woken to find the mule gone and the money gone, and Thomas's side of the bed cold and undisturbed, in a way that told her he had not even slept there, had left in the night like something that knew better than to face the daylight. But tonight was different. Tonight her mind was working in a way she recognized and distrusted, the circular, repetitive motion of a thought that was not about the horse or the drive or the men. Tonight her mind was working on Wren. She had not let herself do this often. She had understood, before she took the job, that the discipline required was not only physical, not only the early rising and the heavy lifting and the relentless, unforgiving pace of the trail, but mental. She could not afford to spend the next 2 months in the particular anguish of a mother separated from her child, because that anguish would make her slower, would make her careless, would cost her the sharpness she needed to do this work, and do it well enough to earn what she had come to earn. So she had put Wren in a box, a careful, deliberate box with a good latch, and she had told herself, "When this is done, you open it. When you have the money and the farm is settled and you have something real to come home to, then you open it. Not before." But tonight, lying in her bedroll with the smell of linseed oil still on her hands and the sound of the horse's struggling breath still in her ears, the latch gave. Wren at 7 had a very specific way of sleeping. She slept with one arm flung outward as though she had fallen from a great height and was still, in her sleep, in the process of catching herself. She slept with her mouth slightly open. She slept with an expression of such uncomplicated trust that Joe had sometimes stood in the doorway of her room in the farmhouse and felt something that was not quite grief, but was in the same family. A terrible tenderness. The awareness that the trust was not earned, that it was simply given, freely and without condition, the way children give things before they learn that giving freely is a kind of risk. Thomas had walked away from that. Joe had never understood it, and she did not understand it now, lying in the dark under the Kansas stars, and she suspected she never would. She had no framework for it. She had no place to put it. What she had instead was $40 minus 5, and 35 days remaining on the drive, and a daughter who was sleeping somewhere in Caldwell with her arm flung out and her mouth slightly open, and her trust fully intact because she was 7 years old and she did not yet understand what it meant that her father had taken the better bridle. "I'm coming," Joe thought. The way you think something not to an absent person but to the fact of them, the simple, physical fact. "I'm coming, and I'll have enough, and it will be enough." She closed her eyes. She was up at 3. The fire was banked low, and the camp was quiet, and the air had the particular cold clarity of prairie pre-dawn, the kind of cold that was not cruel but was entirely honest. She rebuilt the fire with the efficiency of 3 weeks' practice. Kindling first, then the larger pieces, the specific arrangement that caught fastest. And she was measuring flour when she heard the footsteps behind her. She did not startle. She had stopped startling at footsteps in the dark on about day 4. "It's me," said Brody's voice. She kept measuring. "I know." Aldous Brody was not a man who came to the cook fire at 3 in the morning for coffee, because there was no coffee yet at 3 in the morning. He was also not a man who did things without reasons. In 3 weeks, Joe had cataloged this about him the same way she had cataloged her inventory, carefully, without sentiment, noting what was there. He stood at the edge of the firelight and looked at the camp the way he always seemed to look at things, with a steady, assessing patience that reminded her, oddly, of the sorrel horse. "How is she?" he said. "Better, I think. Emmett's with her." "I know." A pause. "I heard what you did." "I did what made sense to do." "Yes," he said, and something in the way he said it made her look up from the flower. He was looking at her. Not the way the men had looked at her in the first weeks, not with skepticism or challenge or the particular appraisal that was really a form of dismissal. He was looking at her the way you look at something you are trying to understand, and the attention in it was different from anything she had felt directed at her in a very long time. And she did not know what to do with it, so she looked back down at the flower. "The bucket," she said. "The mash. You'll want to find out whose it was." "I intend to." "If it happens again—" She stopped. "If it happens again," Brody said, "it won't be an accident." The word accident sat between them in the firelight, doing exactly the work it was meant to do, raising the question of whether this one had been. Joe looked up again. His face gave her nothing certain, but it gave her enough. He was thinking the same thing she was thinking, and he had come to the cook fire at 3 in the morning, not entirely because of the horse. "Mr. Brody," she said. "Joe," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Aldridge, not ma'am, not the elaborate non-address the men had used in the early weeks when they hadn't known what to call her. Just her name, simple and direct. And the simplicity of it was somehow more unnerving than anything else that had happened tonight. She opened her mouth to say something practical, something about breakfast, about the day's route, about the horse. And then, from the direction of the remuda, Emmett's voice came sharp across the dark. "Brody, she's down again. And there's something else. There's someone out there." The night came apart fast after that. Joe was already moving before Emmett's voice had finished crossing the dark, her boots finding the packed earth by instinct, her hand catching the lantern she'd set on the wagon's footboard. Greer was a step behind her and then alongside her, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say yet. They were both running toward the same unknown thing, and words would only slow them down. The remuda was 40 yards from camp, staked at the edge of a shallow draw where the grass was better. When Joe raised the lantern, the first thing she saw was the sorrel, down again on her side, but breathing. She could see the barrel of the animal's ribs, lifting and falling, with the uneven labor of something that had been fighting hard and was now simply tired. The second thing she saw was Emmett, standing with his arm extended and pointing at the far edge of the picket line, where the darkness beyond the horses was not entirely dark. There was a shape in it, a man shape, low and crouching, and then not crouching any more, upright and moving away fast. "Hey!" Greer's voice came out hard and flat, and then he was past Joe
and past Emmett both, and two other hands who had come stumbling from their bedrolls were following him. And Joe stood with the lantern and the sorrel at her feet and watched the darkness swallow all of them. Emmett stayed. She noted that. He was 19 years old and frightened. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hands had found his belt loops and were gripping them like they were the only solid thing available. But he stayed, and he crouched down beside the horse. "She was up," he said.
20 minutes ago she was up, and I thought she was going to be all right. She may still be. Joe set the lantern down and pressed her palm flat against the sorrel's neck. The skin was damp and trembling finely, like the surface of water in a wind, but the pulse beneath it was there, fast and thready, but there. She went down again because she's exhausted, not because she's worse. There's a difference. Emmett looked at her. In the lantern light, his face was very young. "How do you know that?" "I don't entirely, but I've seen both, and this looks more like one than the other." She paused. "Go get me the warm water that's still in the pot, and the oilcloth from under the second bench. She needs to be kept from the cold ground as much as we can manage." He went. He didn't argue, didn't hesitate, and she was grateful for it in a way she didn't have time to examine. She stayed with the horse and listened to the sounds the night made, the cattle settling somewhere to the north, the low percussion of boots on dry ground, a voice that might have been Greer's raised in a direction she couldn't place, the shape in the dark. She turned it over in her mind while her hands worked, straightening the sorrel's neck, checking the animal's gums for color. Someone had been at the picket line. Someone who had not wanted to be seen. The spoiled grain had not been an accident. She had suspected it from the beginning, in the way she suspected most things, quietly, without announcing the suspicion, waiting for it to either prove itself or dissolve. It had not dissolved. Emmett came back with the water and the oilcloth, and they worked together in a silence that was almost comfortable. He was clumsy with the oilcloth, tucking it wrong twice, and she corrected him without comment, just moved his hands to the right position and let him do the work himself. He seemed to understand that she was not dismissing him, only teaching, and he paid attention. "You're getting better at this," she said after a while. He glanced up. "At what?" "At being useful." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Denny said you were going to quit after the first week." Joe looked at him. "Did he?" "Said no woman would last." "And what do you think now?" Emmett's mouth did something complicated. Not quite a smile, not quite an apology. "I think Denny says a lot of things he doesn't mean." Denny Falk appeared at the edge of the lantern light a few minutes later, his shirt half tucked and his hair still crushed from sleep. He stood there for a moment, looking at Joe and the horse and Emmett, and Joe could see him calculating something, the way boys that age always seem to be calculating, measuring the distance between where they were and where they wanted to be thought of as being. "Emmett said there was someone," he said. "There was," Joe said. "Greer went after him." Denny looked at the sorrel, then at the bucket, the same bucket she had removed the spoiled grain from 2 hours ago, now sitting empty near the picket post. He looked at it for a long time. "That wasn't an accident," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Joe said. "I don't think it was." Something moved across his face, something she couldn't quite name. Not guilt, not quite. More like the expression of someone who has been carrying a piece of information they weren't sure what to do with.
and has just been given permission to set it down. "Denny," she said quietly, not looking up from the horse. "If you know something, now would be the time." The silence stretched. She let it. She had learned early in her marriage that the worst thing you could do when you wanted the truth from someone was to fill the silence they needed to find it in. "I saw Haskell," he said finally. "Yesterday evening, near the grain. I thought it was nothing." Joe nodded. She kept her hands moving, kept her voice level. "All right." "I should have said something." "Yes." Another silence. Then, "Are you going to tell Greer?" "I'm going to let Greer come back and tell me what he found," she said. "And then we'll see what needs telling." Denny crouched down across from her, on the other side of the sorrel. He looked at the horse for a while, and then he looked at his own hands, the right one, which still had a bandage on it, the rope burn she had rewrapped 3 days ago without making a production of it. He had come to her with it wrapped in a piece of flour sacking, tied badly, already showing the early signs of the kind of infection that could turn serious on a long drive. She had unwrapped it, cleaned it, wrapped it again with something better, and handed him back his hand without a word about how he'd done it wrong the first time, or how he should have come sooner. He had not thanked her then, but he was here now, crouching in the dark beside a sick horse, staying when he didn't have to. She thought that might be the same thing. Greer came back an hour before dawn. He came back alone, which told her something. His face told her more. Not angry exactly, but settled into a hard, flat expression that she had not seen on him before. He stood at the edge of the lantern light and looked at the sorrel, who had gotten to her feet 20 minutes ago and was now standing with her head low, but her legs steady, accepting water from a bucket, with the careful deliberateness of an animal that has decided, provisionally, to continue living. "She'll be all right," Joe said. Greer nodded. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been given one good piece of news in a night full of bad ones, and was accepting it without ceremony. "Haskell's gone," he said. Joe looked at him. "Took his horse and his kit sometime in the last 2 hours. Didn't come back to camp." Greer's jaw moved. "I've got men looking, but this country's dark, and he's got a head start, and I think—" He stopped. "I think he wanted to go." "He put the grain out," Joe said. It wasn't a question either. "That's what I think. Denny saw him near the grain yesterday evening." Greer looked at Denny, who was still crouching by the sorrel's head. The boy met his eyes without flinching, which Joe thought was something. "He should have said something sooner," Greer said. "He's saying it now," Joe said. "That's what matters." Greer looked at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't read in the lantern light. Or perhaps she could read it and was choosing not to, because reading it would require her to think about what it meant, and she had enough to think about. "Why would Haskell poison a horse?" she said. "It's not my horse. It doesn't hurt me." "It hurts the drive," Greer said. "Slows us down, creates trouble." He paused. Or maybe he wasn't thinking past the trouble. "He was thinking past something," Joe said. "A man who just wants to cause trouble does it openly. He didn't want to be seen." The silence settled between them. The sorrel shifted her weight, and Denny steadied her with a hand on her neck. automatically, without thinking about it. "I need to know," Joe said, "whether this is finished or whether it isn't." Greer looked at her steadily. "I don't know yet." "Then I need to know that too." He nodded once, slowly. "Fair enough." She picked up the lantern. There was breakfast to start. There was always breakfast to start. The world could be coming apart at its seams, and the biscuits still needed to be made by a certain hour, or the whole day went wrong. She had learned that about herself in the past 3 weeks. The work was not an escape from the difficult things, but it was a place to put herself while the difficult things resolved or didn't, and that was worth something. She was halfway back to the wagon when Denny's voice came after her. "Miss Joe!" She turned. He was standing now, the sorrel behind him, the lantern light catching the side of his young face. "I'm sorry," he said, before, the first week, the things I said." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Thomas, who had never apologized for anything. She thought about Wren, who was sleeping in a boarding house in Caldwell and who needed her mother to get to Abilene and back. "Get some sleep," she said. "Breakfast is in 3 hours, and I'll need someone to carry water." He nodded. She turned back toward the wagon. It was only when she was climbing up onto the footboard, reaching for the flour sack, that she noticed the second lantern, the one she kept on the wagon's far side, the one she hadn't lit tonight. It was lit now. Someone had lit it while she was at the remuda, and sitting on the footboard beside it, weighted down with a small stone so it wouldn't blow away in the prairie wind, was a folded piece of paper. Her name was written on the outside in a hand she didn't recognize. She stood there for a moment with the flour sack in her hands and the lit lantern casting its small circle of yellow light, and she looked at the paper. And she thought about Haskell gone into the dark, and the shape at the edge of the picket line, and Greer's face when he said, "I don't know yet." Then she picked it up. The note said, "Stay out of it. This is your only warning." No signature. No other words. Just the 7 of them, written in a cramped, careful hand, on a piece of paper torn from something larger. She could see the ragged edge on one side, the clean cut on the other. Someone who'd planned it then. Someone who'd had the paper ready. Joe stood in the lantern light for a long moment, reading it again as though it might say something different the second time. It didn't. She folded it back along its crease, tucked it into her apron pocket, and began making biscuits. She had learned in the years of her marriage that the worst thing you could do with a threat was let it rearrange your hands. Your hands had work to do. If you stopped them, the threat had already won. By the time the hands came in for breakfast, she had biscuits and salt pork and a pot of beans that had been soaking since the previous afternoon. She served them the same as always, moving down the line with the ladle, watching faces. Haskell came through without looking at her. Emmett said "Thank you, ma'am," the way he always did, like someone had raised him right before things went wrong. Denny Falk took his plate and sat apart from the others, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he didn't eat. He sat with the plate balanced on his knee and looked out at the flat country to the east and chewed at the inside of his cheek. Joe noted it and said nothing. Greer came last, the way he always did, checking the line of men before he fed himself. He paused at the wagon. "Anything happen after I left?" he asked. No, she said. Emmett and I kept her stable. She was standing by first light. Greer looked at her for a moment with that measuring expression she'd come to recognize. Not distrust, exactly, but the careful attention of a man who knew that people showed you what they wanted you to see, and that sometimes you had to wait for the rest of it. Good, he said. He took his plate and walked away. She thought about the note in her apron pocket. She thought about telling him. She decided to wait. It was Hector Vane who came to her that afternoon. She was inventorying the dry goods while the drive moved, the wagon rolling steadily northeast with the herd raising its familiar cloud of dust to the south. She had the flour sack open and was running the numbers in her head. How many days to the next supply point? How many men? How much they ate when the work was hard versus when it was easy? When she heard a horse come alongside the wagon and stay there, she looked up. Hector Vane was a compact man, built low and solid in the way of someone who had spent his whole life on horseback and had the body to show for it. He wore a hat that had been through more weather than most men see in a lifetime, and his face was the color and texture of old saddle leather, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth. He had dark eyes that were very still. She had noticed in the weeks since the drive began that he was one of the few men on the crew who never seemed to be performing anything. He simply was what he was, and he watched what was happening, and he said what needed saying and nothing more. He had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times since Caldwell, always about logistics, always useful. "Mrs. Calhoun," he said. "Mr. Vane?" He rode alongside in silence for a moment, watching the country ahead. Then, "Someone left you something last night." It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "I saw it," he said. "I was coming back from the south end of the herd. Whoever left it was already gone." He paused. "I didn't see who." "It was a note," she said. "I figured." "It told me to stay out of it." He absorbed this without visible reaction. He had the rare quality, she had noticed, of being entirely comfortable with information that would make other men restless. "What did you do with it?" "I kept it." Something moved in his expression, not quite approval, but close to it. "Good," he said. He was quiet again for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned that Hector Vane did not leave things half-finished. He would get to the point in his own time. "The grain bucket," he said finally. "I looked at it this morning." "So did I." "Then you know." "I know it was cut," she said. "The seam, not worn through, cut, so it would hold long enough to be set down and walked away from, and then fail slow." He nodded. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who's been around livestock. That's most everyone on this drive. She allowed that with a tilt of her head. But not all of them had reason. Vane turned to look at her then, directly, the way he rarely did. Most of the time he watched the country, watched the herd, watched the periphery. Looking straight at a person was, for him, a deliberate act. "You have a theory," he said. "I have an observation," she said carefully. "I don't know enough yet to call it a theory." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "The man at the picket line last night. Greer thinks it was a drifter. Someone who saw the drive and thought about the horses. Do you think that? A long pause. No. Neither do I. The wagon hit a rut, and she steadied herself against the seatboard. The herd moved on its slow, enormous way in the middle distance, a sound like low, continuous thunder. She thought about the note again, the careful hand, the torn edge. Someone who'd had the paper ready. "Mr. Vane," she said, "how much does this herd sell for in Abilene?" He looked at her with those still, dark eyes. "Depends on the market, somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000. She nodded slowly. "That's enough money," he said, "for a man to do things he otherwise wouldn't. Or for someone to want the drive to fail. Or for someone to want it to arrive short," he said. "Fewer cattle means a lower payout. Means Greer has to explain a discrepancy to the Driscoll Company." He paused. "Means questions." She thought about Denny Falk, sitting with his untouched plate, staring east. She thought about Haskell, who had been the first to find the grain bucket, who had gone quiet since the night at the remuda in a way that was different from his earlier hostility. Not sullen, but careful. She reached into her apron pocket and held out the folded note. Vane took it, read it, handed it back. "Keep that," he said. "I intend to." He was quiet for another stretch of trail. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass to the west, and the sound of it was so clean and ordinary that it seemed almost insulting given the conversation. Then Vane said, "I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Calhoun, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it." "All right." "I have been on 17 drives," he said. "Comanche country, drought, stampede, sickness, flood. I have seen men die from bad luck, and I have seen men die from bad intentions. I have seen drives fail because of weather, and I have seen them fail because someone on the inside wanted them to." He looked at her steadily. "What you did with that horse, the treatment, keeping the men steady, the way you worked, that was good work. The kind of work that holds things together when things want to fall apart." He paused. "The men know it, even the ones who don't want to know it." She waited. "What I mean to say," he said, "is that you've earned a right to be here that has nothing to do with Greer hiring you. And someone on this drive knows that, and it worries them. Because a cook who holds things together is harder to work around than a cook who doesn't." His voice was entirely level. "The note is not a coincidence. You're close to something. I don't know yet what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me plainly." "I find it saves time." "It does." He gathered his reins, preparing to ride back to the herd. Then he stopped. "One more thing, Falk." She said nothing, just waited. "He's been with the Driscoll Company 3 years. Before that, I don't know. Nobody does." Vane's voice was careful, measured, giving her the fact and nothing more. "Greer trusts him. He has reason to. But trust is built on what you know. And there are things about Falk that nobody knows." He settled his hat against the afternoon wind. "I'm not saying anything. I'm saying, watch." "I've been watching." "I know," he said.
That's why I'm talking to you." He turned his horse and rode back toward the herd, and she sat on the wagon seat with the flower inventory in her lap and the note in her pocket and the long Kansas afternoon opening out ahead of her, gold and enormous and entirely indifferent. That night, after supper, after the men had settled and the fire had burned down to coals, Joe sat at the back of the wagon doing the mending she'd been putting off for 3 days. It was quiet work, and she liked it for that reason. It kept her hands occupied and left her mind free. She was thinking about what Vane had said. Close to something. She turned the phrase over and examined it. She had not set out to be close to anything. She had set out to cook 3 meals a day and keep the wagon stocked and get to Abilene with her $40 and go home to Wren. That was the whole of her ambition. That was everything she had room for. But the drive had its own logic, and she had been in it long enough that its logic had become hers, whether she'd chosen it or not. The horse, the grain bucket, the figure at the picket line, the note. Stay out of it. She bit off a thread and held the mended shirt up to examine the seam. Footsteps in the grass behind her. She turned. It was Emmett, the young hand who had helped her through the night at the remuda. He was holding something. She could see it in his hands, pale in the darkness, small. "Ma'am," he said. He was nervous. She could hear it in the single word. "I found something. I wasn't sure who to tell. I thought maybe you." He held it out. Another piece of paper, but this one was different, larger, folded multiple times, and when she took it and opened it in the thin light from the dying fire, she could see it was not a note. It was a map. Hand-drawn, rough but legible, with landmarks she recognized, the creek crossing they'd made 4 days ago, the line of the trail, the position of the herd. And marked on it, in the same cramped, careful hand as the note in her pocket, a location. Off the trail, perhaps 2 miles northeast. And beside the location, 2 words. She read them twice. Then she looked up at Emmett's pale, frightened face and asked, very quietly, "Where did you find this?" "In Falk's saddlebag," he said. "I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the hobble straps he borrowed, and it just fell out." Joe looked back down at the map, at the 2 words written beside the marked location. Second herd. She folded the map slowly, slid it into her pocket beside the note, and said, "Don't tell anyone. Not yet." The map sat in her pocket like a coal all afternoon. Joe drove the chuck wagon northeast along the trail, the same direction the map indicated, and tried to keep her eyes on the horizon the way a sensible woman would, watching for the next campsite, reading the grass, noting where the creek bent, instead of scanning every rise and hollow for something that shouldn't be there. She had learned in the years of her marriage that fear was most dangerous when it made you obvious. Thomas had taught her that without meaning to. He'd always known when she was afraid of him, and knowing had made him worse. So she kept her face arranged and her hands steady on the reins, and she thought. Second herd. 2 words that explained a great deal and complicated everything else. If there was a second herd being held somewhere northeast of the trail, off the maps the Driscoll Company would have filed with the county, then someone was moving cattle that didn't belong to them. The sabotage, the sorrel mare, the threatening note, the deliberate and patient campaign to disrupt the drive, wasn't aimed at her, not really.
She had simply been convenient. A woman in a man's place, easy to blame, easy to use as noise, while the real business happened somewhere to the northeast, out of sight. The question was, who? She thought about Denny Falk sitting apart at breakfast, not eating. She thought about the unreadable expression that had crossed his face when he'd studied the grain bucket. She thought about how a man might look if he were deciding, in that moment, whether to tell the truth or let someone else carry it. She thought about Amos Tull. Tull had not come to dinner in 4 days. She had noticed it the way she noticed everything about the men's habits, because their habits were her work, because feeding 40 men on a moving drive required knowing who ate what and when and how much, and because a man who stopped eating was a man whose reasons deserved attention. The first night she'd set his plate aside without comment. The second night she'd asked Emmett casually whether Tull was riding night herd, and Emmett had said he didn't think so. The third night she'd simply watched the place where Tull usually sat and confirmed the absence without making anything of it in her expression. Tonight would be the fourth night. She pulled the wagon to a stop at the campsite she'd selected. Flat ground, good drainage, the creek near enough to haul water, but far enough that the sound of it wouldn't cover other sounds, and climbed down and began her work. The fire first, then the beans she'd had soaking since this morning, then the cornbread, the salt pork, the dried apple she'd reconstituted and sweetened with the last of the sugar she'd been rationing since the second week. She worked with her back to the open plain and her face to the fire, and she did not look northeast. The men came in with the herd, dusty and loud and grateful the way they always were at the end of a long day, and they took their plates and found their places, and Joe counted them without appearing to count them. Tull was not there. Neither was Falk. She served the last man, set the pot back on the grate to stay warm for the night riders, and then turned and found Aldous Greer standing at the edge of the firelight, holding his plate and looking at her with the expression he wore when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "Mr. Greer," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge." He sat down on the camp stool she kept near the wagon for him, the one nobody else used because nobody else was fool enough to take the trail boss's stool. "You eat yet?" "I will." "Sit down and do it now," he said. "I want to talk to you." She made herself a plate, smaller than she'd make for any of the men, as always, and sat on the wagon step across from him. The fire was between them. She could feel the weight of the map in her pocket and the note beside it, and she decided, looking at his face, that tonight was the night. "Tull hasn't come to camp in 4 days, she said, before he could speak. Greer looked at her for a moment. "I know." "And Falk wasn't at dinner." "I know that too." He ate a bite of cornbread, chewed it slowly, swallowed. "Mrs. Aldridge, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight." "I generally do." "What do you know about what's been happening on this drive?" She reached into her pocket. She took out the note first, unfolded it, and held it across the fire to him. He read it without taking it from her hand, and his jaw tightened in a way she had come to recognize as his version of visible anger. Then she took out the map, Emmett's find, still creased from the saddlebag, and held that out too. She watched him read it, watched his eyes stop on the 2 words beside the marked location, watched the tightening happen again, deeper this time. "Where did you get this?" he said. Emmett found it in Falk's saddlebag this afternoon. It fell out when he was looking for borrowed hobble straps." She paused. "He wasn't looking for it." "But you kept it." "I kept it." Greer set his plate down on his knee and looked at the map for a long moment without speaking. Around them the camp moved through its nightly rhythms, men talking, boots scraping, someone's harmonica starting up and then stopping again. The fire popped. One of the cattle dogs circled the edge of the light and disappeared. "There's a man named Casper Doyle," Greer said finally, "who has been trying to get ahead of Driscoll's contracts in Abilene for 2 years. He's run 2 drives himself, both of them short, meaning they arrived with fewer head than they left with, and nobody could prove why." He looked up at her. "I've suspected since the 2nd week that someone on this crew was feeding him information, slowing us down, giving him time to move a cut herd north by a different route and arrive first." Joe thought about the sorrel mare, down on the ground with rigid limbs. She thought about how a lame horse meant a delayed drive. About how a cook who was too frightened to function meant cold food and sick men and more delay. About how the note had said, "Stay out of it," which was only useful to say to someone who was already in it. "They weren't trying to run me off," she said slowly. "They were trying to use me, make enough trouble around me that you'd be watching the wrong part of the herd." Greer looked at her with something that might, on another man's face, have been respect. "That's what I think," he said. "And Tull?" Greer was quiet for a moment that lasted too long. "Amos Tull lost his brother on a drive 3 years ago," he said. "Outfit called the Meridian Company. Drive went bad. Sickness, a stampede. The cook for the neighboring outfit was a woman, and Tull decided she was the cause of it." He paused. "I knew all of this when I hired him. He's a good hand. I thought he'd manage himself." "He managed himself by making my life difficult enough that you'd be watching me instead of him." "Joe." He said her name for the first time in 6 weeks, without the Mrs., without the formality, and the sound of it in his voice made her look up sharply. He was looking at the map. "The location marked here is 2 miles northeast. Hector Vane rode that direction this afternoon on my instruction and didn't come back." The harmonica started up again, somewhere behind them. The fire settled. "How long ago did he leave?" she asked. 4 hours. She stood up. She set her plate down on the wagon step with a deliberateness she did not feel. "Then we need to go now," she said. "I'm not taking you out there." "You're not taking me anywhere," she said. "I'm going. You can come, or you can stay here and wonder what I find." She looked at him steadily. "You have a crew to manage and a herd to hold. I have a wagon that can move quietly and a reason to be driving it northeast that nobody will question, because I've been scouting camp positions since the first day." She held out her hand. "Give me the map." He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face. "There's a Winchester under the wagon seat," he said. "Left side." "I know," she said. "I put it there." He gave her the map. She drove without a lantern, which was either brave or foolish, and she had stopped distinguishing between the two sometime around the 3rd week. The moon was 3/4 full, and the grass was pale under it, and she could see the land well enough to pick her way northeast without the creek or the trail to guide her. The Winchester was across her knees. The horses were the two quietest ones she'd requested specifically at the start of the drive, a pair of grays who pulled without complaint and didn't spook at shadows. She smelled the second camp before she saw it. Wood smoke and cattle and the particular warm, grassy smell of a herd at rest. She stopped the wagon on the far side of a low rise and sat listening. Voices. 2 of them, maybe 3. She recognized one. She had heard it for 6 weeks at a distance, low and deliberate, the voice of a man nursing a grievance with patience and conviction. Amos Tull's voice, coming from the hollow on the other side of the rise, talking to someone she couldn't yet see. And then another sound underneath the voices, a sound she knew the way she knew the creak of her own wagon wheel, the way she knew the smell of her daughter's hair, a sound so familiar it stopped her breath entirely. A groan, low, human, and unmistakable. Hector Vane was alive then, but he was not free. Joe sat very still on the wagon seat, with the Winchester across her knees and the map in her pocket, and the fire of the second camp flickering at the bottom of the rise, and she looked at the distance between herself and the voices and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had been in worse positions than this. She had been in a mortgaged farmhouse on a Tuesday morning with a mule gone and a daughter sleeping in the next room, and no plan at all. This, at least, was a plan. She wrapped the reins around the brake handle, checked the Winchester's load, and climbed down from the wagon without a sound. The second camp was smaller than she'd expected. 3 men around a low fire, a rope corral strung between cottonwoods, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the particular restless sound of cattle that don't know where they are. Joe counted the horses at the picket first, the way her father had taught her to count anything before walking into it. 3 horses, 3 men visible. She moved along the bottom of the rise with the Winchester at her side, and the darkness doing what darkness does when you trust it. She had not formed a plan so much as a direction, and she understood the difference. Amos Tull was one of the 3. She recognized the set of his shoulders before she recognized his face. He had a way of sitting that suggested he was always waiting for something to arrive and was confident it would. The second man she didn't know. The third was Denny Falk, who had his back to her and was speaking in the low, unhurried voice of a man who believes himself unobserved. Joe stopped at the edge of the firelight and said, "I found the map." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Falk turned first. His expression moved through 3 or 4 things before settling on something careful and still. Tull rose from his crouch slowly, the way a man does when he is deciding whether to reach for something. The third man, younger, with a red kerchief knotted at his throat, looked between them all as though waiting to be told what the situation was. "Mrs. Holt?" Falk said. "The map," Joe said again. She kept the Winchester's barrel angled down, but her hand was easy on the stock. "And the note. And the bucket with the cut strap." She let that land. "I want to know whose cattle those are." Tull said, "You should go back to your wagon. I've been told what I should do by men with less cause than you, and it hasn't taken yet." The young man with the red kerchief made a sound that might have been a laugh suppressed at the wrong moment. Falk shot him a look that killed it. "Sit down, Amos," Falk said. Tull did not sit. He stayed where he was, and Joe watched his hands, and the fire popped between them all and sent a thread of sparks up into the dark. "The cattle are Harmon Driscoll's," Falk said at last. "The ones in the corral. The ones we've been moving northeast for 11 days. Joe had thought it might be something like this, a diversion, a second movement. The sabotage on the main drive meant to slow Greer's progress, so the secondary herd could be repositioned before anyone noticed the accounting didn't square. She had thought it, but thinking a thing and hearing it spoken plainly in the dark are different experiences, and she felt the weight of it settle differently in her chest. "Harmon Driscoll is dead," she said. "His brother isn't." Falk looked at the fire. "Webb Driscoll has been buying up grazing contracts in the territory for 2 years. He needed cattle to put on them before anyone checked the titles. Harmon's herd was the easiest source, given that Harmon's estate is still in probate and the lawyers are slow." He paused. "The drive to Abilene is legitimate. It's also a distraction." "And the note?" "That was Tull." Falk said it without inflection, as though it were a minor administrative detail. Tull said, "She was getting too close." "I was cooking," Joe said. "I was getting too close to the stove." "You were watching," Tull said, "counting things, asking questions with your eyes when you didn't ask them with your mouth. I've known women like you before." "Have you?" Joe said. "They're trouble." "Then we have that established." The young man with the red kerchief had gone very still, which Joe noted as a point in his favor. Still men are thinking men, and thinking men were preferable to the other kind when you were standing at the edge of a fire with a Winchester and 3 people who had more reason to move than you did. Falk said, "What are you going to do?" It was the question she had been turning over since she climbed down from the wagon. She had Greer's attention now. She had given him the map, and he had read it, and his face had done something complicated, and she had not yet had time to interpret it. She did not know fully whether Greer was clean. She thought he was. She thought he was a man who ran a drive the way a drive should be run, and did not ask too many questions about the company that employed him, because the questions would cost him a job he needed. That was a different thing from complicity, but it was not entirely innocence either. What she was going to do. She thought unexpectedly of Dodge City. They had come through 4 days ago, the drive pausing at the edge of town long enough for Greer to arrange some business and for the men to arrange some of their own. Joe had driven the chuck wagon to the dry goods store on the main street to replenish flour and salt pork and the particular brand of dried apple that Emmett had eaten through at a rate she found genuinely baffling for a boy his size. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair pinned efficiently and the kind of face that had been handsome young and was more interesting now. She looked at Joe, at the trail dust and the practical boots and the Winchester in the wagon visible through the open door, and did not ask a single question about any of it. "What do you need?" she said. Joe told her, and the woman moved through her store with the ease of someone who had arranged it to suit herself and no one else. And while she worked, they talked, and it was the first conversation Joe had had in weeks that did not require her to manage anything. The woman's name was Letty Marsh. Her first husband had left her, "Not the way yours did," she said, because Joe had mentioned Thomas without meaning to. "Mine had the decency to die of a fever, which at least meant I got the house." And she had come to Dodge City with $11 and the ability to keep accounts, and she had made the store out of those two things and the specific stubbornness of a woman who has been told what she cannot do enough times to stop believing it. "You're going to Abilene," Letty said. End of the drive. And then? Joe had not thought beyond the $40. She had thought as far as the $40, the way you think as far as the next water source when you're crossing dry ground. It was the fixed point, and beyond it was a question she hadn't had the energy to form yet. "I don't know," Joe said. Letty wrapped the dried apples and set them on the counter, and looked at Joe with the direct, unsentimental regard of someone who has assessed many situations quickly and accurately. "The mistake most women make," she said, "is thinking that surviving the bad thing is the same as deciding what comes next. It isn't. Surviving is just surviving. Deciding is a separate act, and you have to do it on purpose, or other people will do it for you." Joe had paid for the supplies and loaded them into the wagon and driven back to camp and not thought about it again until right now, standing at the edge of a fire in the dark with 3 men and a question she had to answer. "I'm going to tell Greer," she said. "He deserves to know what he's been used for." Falk nodded as though this were reasonable. "And Webb Driscoll," Joe said. "Someone with more authority than me needs to know about the cattle and the grazing contracts. I don't know who that is in this territory, but Greer will." "If you do that," Tull said, "Webb Driscoll will know who told." "Yes," Joe said. "He's not a man who takes that quietly." "I expect not," Tull stared at her. "You're not afraid." "I'm extremely afraid," Joe said. "I've been afraid since I found the note. I was afraid before that, if you want the truth. I've been afraid since a Tuesday morning in April when I woke up and my husband was gone, and I had $12 and a mortgaged farm." She looked at him steadily. "Being afraid doesn't change what needs doing. I learned that the slow way." The fire had burned lower while they talked. The cattle in the tree line moved and settled and moved again. Falk said, "I'll go with you, to Greer." Tull turned on him. "Denny, I've been moving stolen cattle for 11 days, Falk said, and I knew they were stolen by the 6th. That's not a thing I can make smaller by not talking about it." He looked at Joe. "I'll tell him what I know." Joe studied him for a moment. She had not expected this, and she was careful with unexpected things. "All right," she said. She had started to turn when Tull moved. He was fast, faster than she'd accounted for, and she had accounted for him, and his hand was on the Winchester's barrel before she had fully registered his motion, and for one long, strange second, they stood there with the gun between them and the fire at her back, and Falk somewhere to her left, not yet moving. And Joe thought, with extraordinary calmness, "Here it is, then." The shot came from the top of the rise, not at either of them. It went into the ground between Tull's feet, kicking up a spray of dirt, and Tull released the barrel and stepped back with the expression of a man who has been reminded of something important. Joe turned. Aldous Greer stood at the top of the rise with a rifle at his shoulder and 2 of the hands behind him, and even at that distance, even in the dark, She could read the particular quality of his stillness, the stillness of a man who has been lied to by an employer and has had some time to arrive at a conclusion about it. He had followed her.
She did not know whether to be grateful or furious, and she stood there holding both feelings at once, which was a thing she had gotten practiced at. Greer descended the rise without hurrying, his eyes moving from Joe to Falk to Tull to the rope corral and the cattle beyond it, taking inventory the way Joe took inventory, systematically, without sentiment. He stopped in front of her. "You climbed down from the wagon," he said. "I did. I told you to wait." "You did." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything about the Winchester still in her hand, or the fact that she had walked into a second camp alone in the dark with a plan that was more direction than plan. "Falk," Greer said, without looking away from Joe. "Start talking." Falk started talking. Joe listened and watched Greer's face change as the shape of it became clear. The scope of Webb Driscoll's operation, the grazing contracts, the probate fraud, the 11 days of stolen cattle being moved northeast while his drive served as the distraction and the cover. She watched him take it in the way a competent man takes information he doesn't like, steadily and without flinching, and with the specific expression of someone already calculating what comes next. When Falk finished, Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Joe. "You knew most of this before tonight," he said. "Not all of it." "Enough of it." "Enough," she agreed. He nodded once and turned to his men and began issuing instructions in a low, even voice, and Joe stood at the edge of the firelight and felt the tension of the last weeks settle into something that was not quite relief. Relief would come later, she thought, or it wouldn't, depending on what Webb Driscoll decided to do about a cattle drive cook who had declined to stay out of it. She thought of Letty Marsh behind her counter in Dodge City, wrapping dried apples with efficient hands. Surviving is just surviving. Deciding is a separate act. She had made it to the decision, at least. She was standing inside it now, whatever it cost. Greer turned back to her. "We'll hold here tonight," he said. "Move at first light." He paused. "I'm sending 2 men ahead to Abilene with a letter." "To who?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between respect and something more complicated. "Webb Driscoll has a lawyer in Abilene," Greer said, "but so does the Driscoll estate, and the estate's lawyer has been looking for exactly this kind of evidence for 7 months. He glanced at the rope corral, at the cattle moving restlessly in the dark. "The problem is that Webb Driscoll also has men in Abilene, and when that letter arrives, he's going to know the drive is 2 days out, and that we're bringing everything with us." Joe understood what he was not quite saying. "He'll move to stop us before we get there," she said. "Yes." "How far are we from Abilene?" Greer looked at the horizon, where the dark was beginning, barely, imperceptibly, to think about becoming something else. 2 days, he said. If nothing goes wrong. He said it in the particular tone of a man who expects something to go wrong,
and Joe recognized the tone because she had been speaking it herself for weeks. And she tightened her hand on the Winchester and looked at the thinning dark to the east and thought about $40 and a mortgaged farm and a daughter named Wren sleeping somewhere safe. And she thought about Letty Marsh, and she thought about the 2 days between here and Abilene and everything that could happen inside them. "Then we better not waste the morning," she said. The ride back to the main camp took 40 minutes, and Joe spent most of it watching the sky lighten by degrees, the black going to indigo, the indigo to a gray the color of pewter, and then the first thin line of orange above the eastern horizon that meant the world was still turning and that she was still in it to see it turn. Greer rode ahead with Tull and Falk between him and 2 of the hands, their wrists bound with rope Joe had cut from the chuck wagon's spare coil. The younger man, she had learned his name was Cord, barely 19, a nephew of Webb Driscoll's by marriage, rode with his head down and said nothing. He had cried briefly when his hands were tied, and Joe had looked away to give him what privacy the open plain allowed. She drove the chuck wagon. She always drove the chuck wagon. Emmett rode up beside her as they crossed back onto the trail proper, the herd a distant lowing presence to the south, the smell of cattle and dust and morning grass all mingled together into something that had, over these weeks, become almost familiar. "You all right?" he said. "I'm functional," she said. He seemed to understand that this was the most honest answer available, and he fell back without pressing her further. She had come to appreciate that about Emmett. He had learned, faster than most men she had known, that asking a woman if she was all right was less a question than a demand, and that functional was sometimes the truer and more honorable word. They reached Abilene on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days and some hours after Joe had stood in the early dark with a Winchester and 3 frightened men, and the town came up out of the plain the way Kansas towns did, suddenly, flatly, without ceremony or apology. The cattle were counted into the stockyard pens by a tired-looking man in a brown coat, who wrote numbers in a ledger with the methodical disinterest of someone who had counted 10,000 cattle that month and expected to count 10,000 more before the season turned. Joe watched from the wagon seat while the hands moved the herd through the gates, and she thought about how the whole enterprise came down to this: weeks of work and weather and trouble, and at the end of it, a man with a ledger and a fence. Greer had sent a rider ahead from their last camp with a message for the county sheriff, and so there were 2 deputies waiting at the edge of town when they arrived, along with a man Joe did not recognize until Greer pointed him out. A federal marshal named Oglesby, compact and sun-darkened, who had ridden down from Topeka on the strength of Greer's telegraph, and who shook Joe's hand with the brief, assessing grip of a man taking the measure of unexpected information. Tull, Falk, and young Cord were handed over with the rope still on their wrists. Falk looked at Joe once as he was led away, a long, flat look that she held without blinking until he turned his head. Tull looked at the ground. Cord looked at nothing. "Webb Driscoll will be harder to touch," Oglesby told Greer, standing beside the wagon while Joe made coffee on the small trail stove she'd set up in the wagon bed. She had decided she was making coffee regardless of what was happening around her, because the drive was effectively over, and she had not had a quiet cup of coffee in 61 days. "That's your problem," Greer said. "It may be, though the woman's testimony will help considerably. Oglesby glanced at Joe. If she's willing. I kept the note, Joe said, not looking up from the coffee. And the cut bucket strap. I have them both in the tin box under the seat. Hector Vane can confirm what he saw, and Emmett Foss can confirm where the map was found. She poured a cup and handed it to Oglesby. I'll write down everything I observed and sign my name to it, if that's useful. Oglesby looked at the coffee, then at her. It's very useful, ma'am. Then you'll have it by this evening, she said, and poured a cup for Greer, and then one for herself. Reverend Silas Prout found her at the wagon an hour later, while she was writing her account in the same ledger she'd used for supply inventory, because it was the only paper she had, and paper was paper. He was a small man, narrow-shouldered, with the particular quality of stillness that certain clergymen develop, the kind that reads as either deep peace or deep discomfort, and in Prout's case, Joe suspected it was more of the latter. He wore a black coat that was clean but had been mended at both elbows, and he held his hat in his hands in the habitual way of a man who has spent years making himself appear humble. "Mrs. Alderton," he said. She looked up. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am. My name is Silas Prout. I serve the Methodist congregation here in Abilene." He paused. "I knew your husband." Joe set down her pen with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing not to react too quickly. "Did you?" "He came through here, perhaps 6 weeks ago. Headed west, he said. California, he thought, or perhaps Oregon. He wasn't entirely certain." Prout turned his hat once in his hands. "He asked me to find you if you came through Abilene with the Driscoll drive." He knew the route. "He knew the route," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." The plains stretched away to the south, where the last of the cattle were being settled into the pens. Somewhere across town, a horse was being shod, the hammer ringing at intervals against the anvil, each strike clean and separate. "What did he want you to tell me?" she said. Prout reached into his coat and produced an envelope, folded once, her name written on it in Thomas's handwriting. The handwriting she had looked at for 8 years on account books and letters, and once a note left on the kitchen table that said, "Back by supper," that she had kept for 3 weeks before throwing into the fire. She did not take the envelope immediately. "He said to tell you he was sorry," Prout offered, as if this were helpful. "He could have told me that himself," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I expect he could have." She took the envelope. She did not open it. She set it on the wagon seat beside her ledger and looked at Prout with the steady, measuring look she had developed over the past 2 months. The look that took a person's full measure and returned a verdict without announcing it. "Thank you, Reverend," she said.
For making the effort. He seemed to understand that he was being dismissed, and he put his hat back on with the careful dignity of a man accepting a gentle correction, and he walked back toward the town. Joe looked at the envelope for a moment, then she picked up her pen and went back to her account. She opened the letter that evening, sitting in the wagon with the canvas sides rolled up to catch the cooling air, the sounds of Abilene coming to her from a comfortable distance, piano music from somewhere,
voices, the occasional whoop of a hand who had been paid and was celebrating the fact with more enthusiasm than wisdom. Thomas's letter was 3 pages, and it said in various arrangements of the same words that he was sorry, that he had been weak, that he had not known how to be the man she needed, that he hoped she would not hate him, that he hoped Wren was well, that the farm had felt like a slow drowning, and he had panicked, that he knew this was not an excuse, that he was sorry again. Jo read it twice. She was looking for the thing that would make her feel something decisive, rage or grief, or the particular cold satisfaction of confirmed judgment.
She found instead something quieter and less useful, the recognition that Thomas had been exactly who he had always been, and that she had known it, and that she had stayed because leaving first had seemed like its own kind of failure. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and held it for a moment. Then she set it in the small tin box beside the threatening note and the cut bucket strap, and she closed the lid. Greer paid her the following morning, standing beside the wagon in the early light with the same flat, practical manner he'd had at the hiring. $40 in bills and coins counted into her hand, and then, after a brief pause, $5 more. "Bonus," he said when she looked at the extra money. "For what?" "For the fact that I'd have lost a significant portion of this herd and possibly faced a fraud charge if you hadn't been paying attention." He said it without particular emotion, as a man states a fact he has verified and found to be accurate. Jo looked at the money in her hand, $45. The farm's mortgage payment was $32. The remainder would buy seed or a second-hand mule, or 3 months of breathing room, which was, she had learned, a different and more valuable thing than she had understood before she'd needed it. "I'll take it," she said. "I know," he said. He started to turn away, then stopped. He was a man who did not say unnecessary things, and so when he turned back, she waited. "The Driscoll Company will run again in the spring," he said. "Same route, roughly. I'll need a cook." "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said, and walked away. She found Hector Vane at the livery, brushing down his horse with the long, slow strokes of a man who was in no particular hurry and preferred it that way. "You heading back?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "You?" "Tomorrow morning." She had already arranged a seat on the eastbound stage to Caldwell, paid for with $2 of her $45. "I want to get back to my daughter." Vane nodded, still brushing. "She'll be glad to see you." "I hope so. She's 7. 7-year-olds have strong opinions about mothers who disappear for 2 months. "Seems fair," Vane said. She had come to say thank you, but now that she was here, she found the words felt too small for what she meant, and she suspected Vane would find them uncomfortable besides. So instead she said, "You're a good man to ride with, Hector." He stopped brushing and looked at her sidelong, and something shifted briefly in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precondition for one. "You're a hell of a cook, Jo." She laughed, a real one, the kind she hadn't had much occasion for in recent months, and he ducked his head and went back to brushing his horse. And she walked back through the Abilene morning with $45 in her pocket
and the particular lightness of a woman who has done a hard thing and come out the other side, still herself. The stage left at 7. Jo sat with her bag on her lap and watched Kansas roll past the window. The flat immensity of it, the grass and sky in their enormous proportions, the occasional windmill turning slowly against the blue. She had looked at this same landscape for 2 months from the seat of a chuck wagon and had found it mostly indifferent to human trouble, which she had come to think of as one of its better qualities. She thought about the farm. The mortgage was manageable now. The mule was gone, but mules could be found. The fields had sat fallow one season, which was not ideal, but was also not catastrophic, and she had a neighbor 2 miles east named Clara Prentice, who had checked on Wren twice a week and who Jo intended to repay in every practical way available to her. She thought about Thomas's letter in the tin box, and she decided, somewhere between one windmill and the next, that she would not answer it. Not out of cruelty. She had examined her feeling carefully and found it was not cruelty, but because there was nothing in the letter that required an answer. He had needed to say the thing. He had said it. That was between him and his conscience, and his conscience was no longer her work to manage. She thought about Wren, who would be at Clara Prentice's house right now, probably eating breakfast and probably talking without stopping, because Wren had always talked without stopping, and Jo had sometimes found it exhausting, and now found that she had missed it, the way you miss a sound you don't notice until it's gone. She thought about $45 and a spring drive, and whether she would take it. She thought she probably would. The stage moved east through the bright morning, and Jo Alderton settled back against the seat and let the miles come, and did not look behind her and watched the horizon for the first familiar shapes of home.